All right, so good afternoon, everybody. And as Kurt mentioned, this is part two of a series of 4 presentations that are focused on more the sedimentary aspects of oceanography, and with, of course, a link to the Namibian Benguela upwelling region. And so this week we have 2 presentations. The first is by Elena Bruni, here from ETH Zurich, and then the second is from Cape French from the USGS in the USA. So I'll start with an introduction to Elena. Elena, unfortunately, is not here, as you will see, because she has to, well, she's in the middle of an exam right now, and so she wasn't able to get out of that to give her presentation. So we have a pre-recorded presentation for you from her, which we've tested, and I think it's fairly clear and easy to follow, so hopefully this will work okay. So Elena is a PhD student here at ETH, and she did her bachelor's degree at the University of Zurich in geography, and then she transitioned to the earth sciences here at ETH for a master's in earth science, and then has continued for her PhD in the group we have here, biogeochemistry group. Elena has been a couple of times already to Namibia, once as a participant in the RGNO, and then the second time as an instructor to assist in this. And she has shaped her PhD project on understanding sedimentological aspects of the Benguela upwelling region, and in particular looking at these systems with very high organic carbon, how their sedimentological behavior may be different from other typical open continental shelf sediments that are more generally studied from this perspective. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and bring up Elena's presentation, which hopefully you can see now. And so Elena will give this presentation. It will finish, and then we will have a pre-recorded question that Kurt has asked of Elena when she made the recording, and then we'll open up this open the floor for questions from any and all of you. So with that, I'd like to now start this recording, and please indicate in the chat or whatever if there's problems with it, but hopefully it will run smoothly.
Good afternoon and welcome to my short talk with the title Determining the Role of Sediment Properties in the Marine Carbon Cycle. Unfortunately, I cannot attend the seminar in person, so this is a recording. I'm very happy though to present you the background of my research. With my research, I often get the question, why would you care about sediment? Because it's just so mud in the ocean, right? How does it affect us? Usually, I choose to answer on something regarding the carbon cycle and the global climate development, as these are buzzwords nowadays anyway. So just to answer this question, why do we care? Now, oxygen minimum zones are present worldwide, and the ongoing global warming results in their spread. This is projected and shown in many studies, such as this one here by Breitburg et al., published in 2016. The oxygen concentrations are shown to decrease in already known oxygen minimum zones, but also other locations. This is somewhat worrying because it has a high impact on life and will affect ecosystems worldwide. Also, low oxygen concentrations will result in a high export of organic carbon, and thus also a drawdown of oxygen in the bottom water column. Sinking organic matter represents one of the major nutrient sources for marine organisms. Its increased availability not only results in a possible overproduction, but also has a positive feedback on the decreasing oxygen concentrations. The accumulation of organic carbon in the surface sediment does not only affect the living beings in the bottom ocean, but also many aspects that fall within the non-living aspect quite a lot. First, we want to focus on sediment because this is what my research is about, right? It is affected as a habitat. So as described before, more nutrients and organic matter at the seafloor will impact the functioning of the ecosystems worldwide. Low organic oxygen, will also affect the basic properties of the sediment, however. We all know from the Benguela upwelling system that it's of soupy and fluffy consistency, or whatever you want to call it. This property is linked to the association of organic carbon with mineral grains, which affects grain sizes, density, and the compaction state of the sediment, and as well its erosion and resuspension thresholds. This is exactly what our study is interested in. So the aim of this talk, or my goal today, is to present you and possibly convince you of the importance of organic carbon on processes such as sediment erosion. Sediment erosion and resuspension is a process which happens, sediment erosion happens in all sorts of environments all over the globe, but it's especially important in the marine system, as the sediment is capable of transporting large amounts of organic carbon for long distances and over long time scales, of course. So with different ecosystems, they might stand in constant interaction with each other. We base our research on the fact that sediment in low oxygen concentrations and high organic carbon concentrations is of soupy consistency, or sloppy, as the acronym of the project says. The key ideas behind this hypothesis are that anoxic sediment has a higher propensity for resuspension due to high organic carbon concentration. I am going to talk about this later on in this talk. Also, we say that organic carbon is transported for long distances, and this is because it is protected by physical and mineral association, by absorption and aggregation mechanisms. And finally, we say, or we can safely say, that the role of organic carbon on sediment topology and its hydrodynamic properties has not been investigated too much before. And we rely a lot on our own measurements because there's not many data out here. My study sites are distributed all over the world and focus on features which make up less than 3% of the world's ocean surface, namely eastern boundary upwelling systems, and their accompanying oxygen minimum zones, of course. These are shown here on this map of oxygen concentrations in the water column. Eastern boundary upwelling systems are connected to the high productivity regions of continental shelves, which are known to contribute largely to the global carbon cycle, even though we don't know whether they are a sink or a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. What is known, however, is that the current strength and the direction of influence organic carbon distribution, as we see on the Namibian shelf. You have all seen possibly such sorts of maps with the longshore bands of organic carbon-rich sediments. So to really understand the ways that sediment is transported in this system and others, the effects of organic carbon on sediment erosion thresholds needs to be understood. And we look into the hydrodynamic properties of a sediment. For this, I have to go back in time and present you the principles of hydrodynamics of the sediment. Already in 1936, Hjellström performed some experiments with sediment grain sizes, and he shows that different grain sizes are eroded at different flow velocities. This was already known and might not surprise you too much, but this was the first scientific description of this relationship. This is a modified figure from Hjellström from 1936, and the lines here you see are the boundaries which separate the different motion fields. On the x-axis, we have grain size, here numerically, and on top with names which you might know, and on the y-axis, their flow velocity. New at the time, and it might still be surprising, is that the curve dips in the small or intermediate grain sizes. which indicates the transition between grain sizes which are dominated by gravitational inhibition of erosion and the smaller grain sizes which are dominated by cohesion forces between the grain sizes. Now, these sediments that are located here in the dip will erode at lower flow velocities than others, and they are preferentially transported. Coincidentally, these are also the grain sizes which are most likely to form aggregates with organic carbon, and they are very common on continental shelves. Today, other studies have been conducted, and they include non-standardized sediment in living conditions. So they go to the field and use non-standardized grain sizes and, well, conditions. This is important because organic matter has a very much lower density than that of pure mineral grains, and it flows easily. So it may have a strong impact on the resuspension and the erosion behavior of a sediment, especially if it is associated with the individual mineral grains. Already Stokes' law, which was postulated in, I guess, the 20th, 19th century, postulates that density needs to be included in any sediment erosion threshold considerations. We, in our study, we combined the experimental and the real side of things by using non-standardized sediments and go to the lab with these and to describe the lower thresholds of erosion of a sediment with high organic carbon concentrations. And this is a representation of how that might look like, this new relationship between organic carbon-rich sediment and, excuse me, which is subjected to currents. On top, we have different associations between organic carbon and minerals as they are described in literature. These somewhat coincide with grain sizes, as you can see here, but most importantly, the amount of organic carbon in the particles increases to the right. So here with free organic matter, we will have more organic carbon than in the microaggregates. The associations are also illustrated here on the right with this figure. There we see how the microaggregates and also pure mineral grains are glued together into an aggregate. Also, something that's very important is that density will decrease from left to right here. So we have a deviation of the standard density, which is largest on this side of the diagram. Unsurprisingly, we expect these large-grained organic matter-rich particles of very low density to behave differently to their pure mineral counterparts, which is illustrated by this red line. Now I might have to clarify why and how organic carbon and mineral grains associate. Already some publications have shown that organic carbon associates with mineral surfaces due to the sorption and other intermolecular forces such as hydrogen bonding and van der Waals forces. These offer protection from microbial degradation, and the four main physical protection mechanisms are illustrated here with these SEM imagery. These show, for example, organic debris, aggregation, and sorption of organic carbon in association with mineral surfaces. An important factor on which one of these associations is present in the environment is oxygen exposure time. Oxygen exposure time has been shown to be of high importance to the quality and quantity of organic carbon, also shown by Arneson and Kyle, who published their paper in 2007. And their figure here shows the importance of oxygen exposure time very well. It shows that with increasing oxygen exposure time, as we see here on the x-axis, we will have a change in the association types. So in low oxygenation states, we will have a lot of organic debris, and in high oxygen exposure times, we will have more sorbed organic matter. Another important relationship exists between organic carbon and mineral surfaces, as it describes the amount of mineral surfaces available for physical protection. This figure with organic carbon on the y-axis and surface area on the x-axis shows exactly this relationship, and it shows that we expect high organic carbon to surface area ratios in high productivity and upwelling regions, where organic carbon forms aggregates with its available surface areas because of the short oxygen exposure time or even the anoxia. With increasing oxygen exposure time and the exposure to environmental forces, organic carbon concentrations will decrease and different types of mineral associations prevail. This is important because high organic carbon concentrations in a sediment will result in a lower density of said sediment. And the sediment will show a higher propensity for resuspension, as we will discuss later on. So this brings me to the factors which we say in our slope hypothesis to influence resuspension behavior. The figure is far from finished and very busy, which is why I break it down into its separate factors. It will explain the concept that I'm talking about rather well, in the end at least. So these red boxes, they are the end members of the system. So the high propensity of a sediment for resuspension and the low propensity for resuspension. They are separated by this gradual relationship, basically, and natural conditions lie somewhere in between. Then this is the backbone of the figure. Above the center relationship, we will plot factors that are influenced by oxygenation state of the system. So on the right, we have anoxic conditions. On the left, we have oxic conditions. And below the center relationship here, we will plot factors that are less or not influenced by oxygenation states. As an additional plane of information, we add the grade of influence of a factor, which is illustrated by the proximity of the factor to the center relationship. So first, let's look at the factors which are dependent on oxygenation state. They are all somewhat connected to organic carbon concentrations. As we see here, with high bulk organic carbon, we expect the sediment to show a high propensity for resuspension. Then the factors which are less influenced by oxygenation state are plotted now. Here we have, for example, the currents and tidal motion or the grain size. Again, the grain size here shows large grains, and if a sediment contains of gravels, we expect it to show a low propensity for resuspension. Attention has to be paid to mixed conditions, which are not shown here as of yet, because natural conditions never only show end member behavior. If our slope hypothesis is correct, this figure might serve as a tool to approximate locations of likely resuspension, and more importantly, locations where organic carbon might accumulate. But narrowing down the field of locations is very difficult, but we are confident that with that in the geological past, suitable conditions were more prevalent, and we are able to track them also with some radiocarbon dating and other measurements. This brings me to my project, which combines the information shown just before to show the impact of organic carbon concentrations on a sediment of any grain size distribution. As the resuspension of low density and populated so by microbes, a sediment has not been studied widely, many of our statements are still based on informed assumptions. However, it is safe to say that we can expect refractory compounds in a resuspended sediment, as well as a peak in silt-sized particles. Also, based on previous studies, we expect low-density particulates of any size to be more likely in suspension than any pure mineral grains. This we support with an ever-increasing number of samples from different oxygen minimum zones all over the world, which we radiocarbon date, and we also measure organic carbon on bulk and some of the fractions of grain sizes and densities, and we perform experiments on surface sediments of intact stratigraphy. So I'm happy to show you some of our data. These are 6 samples from the Benguela upwelling system, which we collected in 2019. A short explanation: on top we have data from the 20 degrees south transect. At the bottom we have the 23 degrees south transect. On the left we have density fractions, and on the right we have grain size fractions. Generally, we see that the data mirrors its trends. So we have the 60 nautical mile stations, which are plotted here. They are usually the oldest fractions, and the 10 nautical mile stations are usually the youngest. But we have a large variability in the data set. Also, we see that small grain size fractions and low density fractions have the most organic carbon. Again, we need more samples to really solidify this point. Now, this is another representation of parts of our data set, this time in a ternary diagram. We only plot the density fractions from the Namibian margin, as well as data from publications, as shown here on the left side. A short explanation also to this diagram: the sites refer to exactly these density fractions, and arrow points towards 100% here. Color indicates organic carbon percentage, so the amount of organic carbon in a sample, and the shape of a symbol refers to its provenance, so where it was extracted. Now, the samples, all of them from Namibia and all the other locations, show a trend to that lower density fractions contain higher organic carbon concentrations, but there again are large variations. But in combination with other molecular markers, such as radiocarbon dating, we are quite confident that we can estimate the ages and even confirm our sloppy ocean bottom hypothesis. So finally, I would like to summarize the key ideas behind the sloppy ocean bottom hypothesis with this conceptual figure. It is a work in progress, as all the figures shown before, but it will likely serve to illustrate my explanation. First, the first diagram here plots oxygen exposure time against organic carbon to surface area ratios. And it explains that with increasing oxygen exposure time, we have a decreasing amount of organic carbon in a sample, illustrated by the size of these circles. But also we see that the organic carbon associations will change, illustrated in the color code. The second graph or diagram here shows that a sediment and its organic carbon concentration will influence the particulate density. And we show this here with these different illustrations. It is directly related to the amount of organic carbon we find in the sediment, of course. And then in the last figure, we see resuspension propensity of a sediment plotted against organic carbon to surface area ratios, and we find that the propensity of resuspension is correlated to the concentrations of organic carbon in the sediment. So the take-home messages I want to highlight are that sediment properties are important for our understanding of ecosystem functioning and organic carbon distribution. So it's not just some mud in the ocean. This is mainly because organic carbon concentration influences sediment erosion and resuspension. But as straightforward as this sounds, there are many factors playing into this. And there's a lot of research still needed. This will be important as the spread of oxygen minimum zones increases with global warming, and it will result in the expansion of the fluffy organic carbon-rich sediment, which is subjected to the exact same lateral transport processes as I just described in this talk. Also, we see that the SLOP hypothesis will have implications for the past or for our understanding of the past and future marine carbon cycling, especially because of the still unknown effects of sediment transported organic carbon. So with this, I would like to thank you all for your interest and for joining. But unfortunately, as I could not attend the seminar in person, I have to refer you all to ask either Tim Eglinton for information on the talk or any of our research, or just write me an email with your questions, comments, or concerns. I'm happy to answer and, of course, to hear from you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Elena. We would like to take the opportunity to ask you still questions. This time it will be me who will ask questions, but more will come during the seminar next Wednesday. I have one question here. Did I interpret it correctly? Mostly your diagrams, OC versus non-OC mineral components. If I see your figure in slide 13, I conclude that most of the Namibian material is of low density, smaller than 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter. That means, if I interpret it correctly, that means that it's loaded with organic matter. Now I meant the one at the bottom to the right, from left.
Bottom right, this one here?
And the two at 50.
This one here, yes.
Right?
Well, yes.
That means,
well, these two have less organic less of this density fraction. But of course, this one here and these two, of course, they have a lot of this density fraction, yes. Now here I also need to explain that we don't really have all of the data yet. So the white color of some of the shapes is because we don't have the bulk organic carbon concentrations of these samples. So I cannot say that this year has no organic carbon in here, but we just don't have the data yet.
okay, so that makes a big difference, of course.
Yes, that makes quite a large difference when reading the diagram, yes.
So how would I read this diagram? Can I conclude that the particles that you studied from the Namibian sediments are in general highly loaded with organic carbon?
Yes, they are, especially in comparison to the other literature data, yes.
Okay, so they float rather easily or resuspended rather easily and can be moved around rather easily.
Yes, that's correct, which is also why we chose the Namibian shelf as an exemplary study site, because it is loaded with organic carbon and it's being studied by many people and we have a lot of information already.
Okay, thank you, Elena. Other questions?
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Yep. So that was the end of the recording, and hopefully it was okay to follow. And so yes, as Kurt mentioned, other questions for Elena, either via me or of course you can follow up with her via email.
Well, Tim, shall I follow up on the other questions here?
Sure.
Okay. You know, I wonder always these materials that have settled, highly enriched in organics, they are more than just organic mineral aggregates. They are also food for bottom-dwelling microfauna. How is that constantly altering, modifying the organic content of these particles? Has that been looked at?
Well, yes, so certainly there's a lot of interest and a fair amount of work that's been done looking at who's there and what they may be doing. As you know, part of Elena's thesis is supposed to be looking at the sort of the microbial side of this, in particular, looking at microbial populations on resuspended particles or particles present within the benthic boundary layer that may be transiting from one part of the shelf or the margin to another, so that they may also be experiencing significant shifts in redox conditions and how that may influence their behavior, or how those conditions may shift the microbial populations associated with moving particle loads. But that's an aspect so far that Elena hasn't embarked on, partly due to COVID limitations. So yeah, you're absolutely right. This is certainly a very dynamic system, and this interplay between what the microbes are doing, what they're producing, what they're consuming, and how that changes the sediment fabric and the hydrodynamic behavior of these of this particulate material is I think, a very central question.
Dion, please.
Oh, hi, good. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Dion.
I just want to make a comment, actually. We also took sediment samples. That was in 2014 and 15. I didn't work directly with these samples. It was a guy from Nice, or a professor from Nice. So he also got really interesting results from the sediment. He was the one, I think, was at the 25-20 nautical mile station. It seems there is some differences between the southern part, far south, and also the northern part, and as she showed, you know, inshore to offshore. So yeah, I just wanted to make this comment that we're still busy writing that up at the moment, but there is some other data also available, and this exactly what she sort of more or less did, but also in depth, the different cores, which was slide from the top to the bottom, I think up to 25 centimeters.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of well, it'd be very interesting to see how those data play out. I mean, as you probably remember, a lot of this work of Elena's was motivated by the presence of this upper slope carbon depot center, which shows up very nicely in the work that's been done by Mike Inthorn, etc. And that's what's really, to us, or to me at least, I found really curious, was a depot center lying under oxygenated bottom waters, but which was still 9–10% organic carbon. And the limited amount of radiocarbon data from that site suggested that it has to have been pre-aged significantly before deposition. And this is what we think is related to this process of mobilization under low oxygen conditions of very organic rich sediments, and this very facile propensity for lateral transport and redeposition. But yeah, the details of this and also the spatial heterogeneity is something I think is really will be worth looking at, as well as down core, as you say.
Yeah.
So far, Elena's mostly been focusing just on core top materials.
I guess Bronwyn has a question.
Hi, Bronwyn.
Yes,
Hi,
just
Bronwyn.
take, hi, hi from Cape Town, but just taking it from a completely other angle with the oxygen and the sediment size, and of course the fauna that have to be adapted, those that are adapted to extremely low oxygen to use it. I'm not talking about the microbial setup, which is important, but if we're looking at the big picture with fisheries and bottom fauna, etc., those that can adapt to the low oxygen combined with a huge amount of carbon, in other words, a huge amount of food there. And that's the side of it that I find interesting. So this all interacts so neatly. Just a comment.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's, I mean, Elena presented it in a this sort of concept in a very simplistic way, and Bronwyn and Dion and others here know this system a lot better than I do. But just based on those short cruises I've participated in, I mean, this huge contrast you see between this sort of inner, very organic rich depositional environment where oxygen is so low that you don't have a strong prevalence of the sulfur oxidizing bacterial mats, then just going a little bit further offshore where those mats become very prevalent, they of course start to impart a sort of a cohesive characteristic on the sediments that would limit resuspension. And this is all happening over just a few kilometers of
yeah, it does. Yeah, the depth transition, and here Paul will be also very aware of when you go down outer slope, I mean outer shelf to down the slope. I mean the difference in faunal composition there, which are also then holding the sediment together because they can live there because of the oxygen. So it's a very, very interesting interaction between the low oxygen, the sediment size, the organic carbon, and there's always this fight between the benthos to how far they can go into the low oxygen areas. So all forming a really fascinating picture. So it was good to hear about this sedimentary stuff.
Okay, thank you, Bronwyn. There will be many, many more questions, and one of them would be, what about the gases that are produced in these aggregates? How does that make them float more easily? And so these are things that have not been addressed yet, but they might one time be addressed. So just in the interest of time, I'd like to finish here unless someone has a really urgent final question to Elena's presentation. If this is not the case, then I like to proceed and ask you, Tim, to please introduce Kate and then have Kate share.